The next topic is about skin color, which I've said a couple of times, at least I hear myself saying it, is mostly is genetically determined. So you have melanin, which we've talked about already quite a bit, and you'll see it again on the next slide. But there's also keratin, which keratin. Um, that you get that's the same thing that you find in carrots. It's kind of an orange yellow pigment, and it can accumulate in the epidermal cells and also in the fatty tissue. So you see, and this picture doesn't come from your book, but it is a picture showing how somebody can have a little bit, their skin can be a little bit oranger because of the accumulation of this pigment. It can be converted to vitamin A, which is important with regard to making the photoreceptor cells in the eyes and a couple of other functions that you have with regard to the body. But some people, particularly people who drink a lot of, I had a friend once who drank a lot of carrot juice. They would juice carrots and have a glass a day. If you have somebody who has fair skin, you really get kind of an orange look to it with that. But ultimately, it just kind of it doesn't necessarily show up in a exaggerated way, I guess. And then this doesn't pigment the skin. Oh, also with regard to the skin color capillary beds, so how close to the surface the capillary beds are and how active they are. Capillary beds are part of your homeostasis, as most things in the body are, and they can be flush with blood. If that happens, then you have more of a pinkish hue. Or if you think about, I think it's something that your book talks about, if you have a fair-skinned person who has just experienced a fright, their blood pressure will drop, so the blood will drain out of their face, and we literally say that you can see the blood draining out of their face. So it actually moves away from those capillary beds. So that affects the skin color also, as well as a couple of other DNA genetic factors. Just another fact, skin is responsible for the beginning of vitamin D synthesis. What you have in your stratum basale and also your stratum spinosum is the ability to convert a steroidal cholesterol molecule into a precursor of vitamin D, actually vitamin D3. And so that's cholecalciferol. That's the steroidal compound that's able to be converted in the presence of UV light, UV radiation. Then that is taken to the liver, where the liver converts it to an intermediate product, then onto the kidney, and the kidney then turns it into calciferol, which is vitamin D that we recognize. And what that does is helps you absorb calcium and phosphorus. Very important. Calcium and phosphorus. Calcium specifically is important for muscle contraction. Think of the heart muscle, and also calcium and phosphorus important for bone maintenance. This is your image from your book of a actual microscopic slide of a melanocyte in the stratum basale. I think I've kind of beat this to death in terms of what it does in the presence of UV light, but even outside of the presence of UV light, melanin is a yellow-brown or black pigment. So it can be yellow-orange or brown-black, and produced by these melanocytes. And we are genetically predisposed to actually make more or less of the pigment itself, and then of what particular aspect of, or what particular color or color combination of the pigments produced. Sorry, I messed up in my forwarding of the slides. The function, again, is to protect the skin from sun damage. skin needs to be exposed to the sun in order to make vitamin D prior to actually having a synthetic version of it. That's the way we got vitamin D, very important. Plus, there are other features that the skin brings in that probably aren't totally understood with regard to our moods and our ability, I guess our mental state, not totally understood about that. So there probably are other functions that they are still finding out with regard to the skin being exposed to the sun. So that's why you have developed these melanocytes to protect us. And sorry about cutting that off, but this again comes from your book. The whole thing comes from your book, so if you want to see that melanocytes produce and store melanin, it's in your book. And then, sorry, this is where I moved this on to the dermal layer. So that was all the epidermis. That was the outer layer of this cutaneous membrane we call the integument. The inner layer is the dermis, and I apologize in advance, but I'm trying to use the same terms that your book uses between layer, strata, and tissue. So this papillary layer is the outermost portion of the dermis, outer meaning closer to the surface of the skin, so closer to the basilar layer of the epidermis, and then the deep layer is the reticular, which we've seen this before. And this is reticular layer, not to be confused with reticular tissue. So the papillary layer is made up of areolar tissue, and that's the kind of tissue where you have a little bit of fibers, collagen and elastin fibers with other things embedded in it. So it's kind of that loose, irregular type arrangement, that type of tissue. Contains smaller capillaries, lymphatics, sensory neurons, and has those dermal papilla that we talked about already, creating the ridges. The reticular layer of the dermis is made up of dense irregular connective tissue. So this layer is going to have more fibers, and they are also going to be in a jumbled arrangement. When you think of the jumbled arrangement of the fibers, you're thinking of strength in many directions. This particular layer has larger blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, nerve fibers, so everything is bigger. Everything's bigger in the reticular layer. You can think about that. Collagen and elastin fibers and connective tissue proper with regard to that reticular layer. What happens is in the reticular layer with these collagen and elastin fibers, they actually will extend up into the papillary layer. And so the bond between the two layers is strengthened by the fact that these fibers actually transverse the two layers. And they'll also go down into the hypodermis, into the subcutaneous fat layer, which is the connective tissue proper layer, which isn't really considered part of the cutaneous membrane, but we talk about it when we talk about the cutaneous membrane. The subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermal layer, both meaning the same thing, is that layer of fat that connects the cutaneous membrane to the underlying tissue. Also provides a very important function with regard to maintaining temperature. But these collagen fibers and elastin fibers will transverse all of those areas and keep them all together because of that, or make the bonds even stronger because of that. And here you have the same image that we had, I believe, in the first slide, only this time we cut it off like crazy. This, you can see the epidermal layer, the two layers of the dermis, and then you can also see this this idea of the larger vessels in the reticular layer and smaller vessels in the papillary layer of the dermis. and a little bit, not really, it's not really showing you how these fibers, but it kind of shows you how these fibers go on from the reticular layer down into the hypodermis here in this particular image. The other thing that this particular slide is showing you, sorry, I'm a little bit off my game on the slides, is this is showing you the circulation. You have no blood flow to the epidermis, so there's no blood there, but what you have is a larger pool of blood in the reticular layer, less in the outer layer of the dermis. You do have kind of an interface between the two. There is a relationship between the two. Certainly a capillary bed is going to extend in through both layers, but it's just, if you are cut down to the dermal layer or down to the reticular layer, you're going to bleed much more profusely than the papillary layer of the circulation, of the dermal circulation. And then this is a nice, what do I say, a microscopic look of adipocytes, subcutaneous layer. This is made up of elastic areolar tissue plus adipose cells. It connects with the reticular layer by connective tissue fibers. There are very few capillaries in this particular layer, very few mitochondria, not too much nerve involvement here. It's mostly just your place where you store your stored form of energy. Fat distributions themselves are determined by hormones. So this is actually carries on throughout the whole life, but what happens is during puberty, that's prior to puberty, the male and female body looks very similar. Certainly if you think of a baby, a male baby, female body in terms of fat distribution, very similar. You go into a toddler, into a kid. As the kid approaches puberty, so 11, 12, the fat distribution tends to change between males and females, and that's the hormonal patterns. That hormonal pattern is the major one we're talking about, but that actually does continue, and that is something that's very much being studied with regard to obesity rates and where fat is put down in an individual, because it does affect their ability to stay healthy, particularly their predisposition for cardiovascular diseases, but that's kind of another topic. The rest of the accessory organs of the body, so I guess not the rest, but to speak about the accessory organs of the integument: hair, hair follicle, oil and sweat glands, and nails are the accessory structures. They're located in the dermis, as I said before, but they project up and through the skin surface, so through the epidermis. They function on the epidermis as well as they function in the dermis. Their function is slightly different. Hair is found everywhere except for the palms of your hands, the soles of your feet, your lips, your genitalia. You may not see it, so it may not be visible, but it's there, unless of course you have some sort of disorder where you have no hair. And what hair does, hair is in an anatomical aspect of hair is to protect and insulate. Guards against large particles, insects, sensitive to touch. But hair also has a relationship with regard to our biological attractions too. That tends to be a kind of a different topic, but it does have that function. Types of hair are you have thin, soft hairs, and it looks like I'm running out of time. I'll have to pick up the thin, soft hairs on the next one and finish out this on the next portion of this lecture.